the world getting more protectionist? And if it is, should we be worried? Here in Europe, policymakers and analysts are digesting the impact of US President Joe Biden's decision to impose a 100% tariff on electric cars from China. Some describe the gesture as largely symbolic, given that the United States imports only a small volume of vehicles from China. But others say the levies could have a far-reaching effect in other parts of the world. Among those in that second camp is the economist Gabriel Felbermayr, director of the Austrian Institute of Economic Research, who joins me now. Mr. Felbermayr, you think these tariffs will have a big impact on Europe. How so?
Hi, Kate. Thanks for having me. So I think it's true that the US now import only very few electric vehicles from China, but this is the situation that we see today. China is building massive overcapacity in the sector, and if the US market is closed to electric vehicles from China, those electric vehicles have to go somewhere else. And so that means it has the tariff have effects on other regions in the world, including the European Union, but also other large economies where the share of electrical vehicles in total automotive sales is going up. And the fact that the Biden administration has not consulted with its partners is a bad sign too, because what we would probably need, in particular across the Atlantic, is more cooperation when it comes to China, and not the very sudden and also surprising kind of intervention that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that, because from what you're saying, it seems like the idea of Chinese oversupply is an inevitability. Do you think there's anything we can do globally to stop this?
So it's true that the Chinese automotive sector is very early in the process. They have started to build up capacity while the Europeans and the Americans and others have been lagging behind in ramping up the production of electric vehicles. Capacity per se is not the issue, because the world is moving towards electric vehicles. But what is disturbing right now is that in many geographies, including in China itself, demand for electric vehicles is not growing as was projected, and that creates a problem. That creates the oversupply topic that we have now. And so it's not so much the fact that the Chinese produce more cars. This is the largest car market in the world, and so that's not per se the problem. It's the fact that there's too little demand. And so in a sense, one can be hopeful that as time goes by, the overcapacity issue will become less important, because with higher demand, the larger production capacity in China is not that big of an issue. But there are price effects, of course, through this large ramping up of production in China that have repercussions across the globe too.
If Biden had consulted with his European partners, what would they have said?
So there is an internal discussion in the European Union about the Chinese electric vehicles. China exports something like 500,000 EVs to Europe. It's a third of total Chinese exports. So Europe is a very important market, and Europe has its own anti-subsidy investigation going with the United States as a partner. Would have probably have required a little bit more time to see what the own investigation delivers. And when Europe goes for anti-subsidy tariffs, which is a possibility, then coordination with the Americans would have been a good thing. Now Europe is more or less coerced into deciding in favor of its own tariffs because of those diversion effects that could occur. And again, it's not that we have to fear 12,000 more cars from the United States going to Europe rather to the US market. It is about the next year and the year thereafter, when the United States would have had probably more imports of those cars without the tariffs that the Biden administration has decided. So together, one could probably have more leverage with the Chinese on the one hand, on the other hand, also avoid those transatlantic, let's say, externalities, negative externalities that we see today. So these tariffs are probably also a big burden on the way that the US and the EU cooperate when it comes to the Chinese question.
Let's talk about a diversion effect in the other direction, though, because it's undeniable that China has made incredible progress in electric mobility over the last few years. Given the strength of its industry, won't it be easy enough for Chinese car makers to avoid these US levies by simply manufacturing in cheaper nearby countries like Mexico instead?
Yes, yes, that will happen, I think. It's happening in Europe too. I mean, Europe has 10% import tariffs on cars, including electrical vehicles, and we see Chinese investment flowing, for example, to Hungary to set up production sites there. But this is what policymakers actually want. No? So even investments into the United States would be probably welcome. That creates value added. Employment, tax revenue in the United States or in neighboring countries, rather than creating all these nice things in China. And so it is one effect that policymakers intend by ramping up tariffs. Less imports, more domestic production. And if the investment for the domestic production comes from China, so be it.
You touched on this earlier, but when it comes to conditions on the Chinese market, the stakes for the US versus, say, German car makers are extremely different. If we look at the figures from 2022, Germany exported 4 times the volume of cars to China as the United States did. Given that differing level of dependence, how would you propose that EU policymakers progress?
So EU policymakers certainly have to be much more careful with China than the US. No? For us, China is more important in 2 ways. It is more important as the export market, as you said, but many European car manufacturers also produce in China and serve the foreign markets, including the European market, with the Chinese production. So BMW, for example, the German car manufacturer, produces in China and sells electric cars produced there in Europe. So an escalation in the bilateral relationship between between Europe and China is something different than between the US and China. We are more exposed, in particular Germany, but because the German automotive industry has a lot of connections into neighboring EU countries, it's the entire European Union that is more exposed to China. And therefore, it is logical, and has been the case over the last years already, that European policymakers need to be more careful and avoid escalation. If it were up to us on our own, I would say, the pros and cons go into the direction of saying no to tariffs on EVs, on electrical vehicles from China, because of the danger that China reacts with retaliation. That too is something that bothers us more in Europe than the Americans.
You mentioned that the EU needs to be more careful, but it also needs to be more unified, doesn't it? Because for the bloc to become stronger on trade, it needs to commit to a much deeper level of unity as well as integration. But there seems to be very little appetite for that among the public, doesn't there?
Yes, that's true. That is part of the European conundrum. I mentioned investment of China into Hungary, for example. So there are countries in the European Union who exploit this division to their advantage. And in principle, we don't have majority voting anymore on many of the questions that we're discussing here. So, for example, in external commercial policy, unanimity is not required, but it has been the practice. This is what, of course, policymakers prefer. And one way forward would be to say that in the area of international trade, the European Union relies more on what the treaties already allow, namely to vote on the basis of qualified majorities. That would give us a little bit more speed and a little bit more leverage relative to trade partners that behave opportunistically like China and increasingly also the United States.
Staying on the issue of a common European policy, the United States is voting in elections this year, and there's a good chance that Donald Trump could return to the White House. During his last tenure, the transatlantic trade relationship was extremely volatile and unpredictable. What has that experience taught European policymakers about how they should approach economic relationships with the US in the future?
I would say we are now better prepared because we already have experienced one Trump administration. And part of the preparation now, what we have learned is that it's not just words, that action follows the words. What we have also understood, I guess, is that the Trump administration did react to counter pressure. One should remember the so-called Rose Garden truce. I think it was in 2018 in the White House where Jean-Claude Juncker and Trump met and discussed. There was already the threat of automotive tariffs by Trump, and there was a counter threat of Europe to tax digital services on a broad scale, the digital sales tax. And at the end, the car tariffs did not come, and the digital sales tax was not rolled out as it was threatened. So I think this is the main lesson, that in order to keep the bilateral relationship up, one needs to have counter threats that need to be credible, need to be implementable. And I talked about preparation a second ago. This is what Europe should be doing now in preparation to the possible second Trump administration. Prepare ourselves where we have those counter threats and how far we are willing to go in using them, because that could be the means of avoiding more bilateral tariffs, and we should be prepared to use that.
Would you say there's more unity within the EU when it comes to dealing with the US than there is with China?
Yes, that's true. The exposure is more symmetric, so that's something we see in the data. And of course, China is also more divisive. It is an autocratic country. It's the whole structure of the Chinese economy is more orthogonal or is more in conflict with the European structures than the US are. So that explains why we are probably more united when it comes to the United States. But there too, the US administration in the last 4 years under Trump did try to divide the Europeans. At the very beginning, I remember very well, it needed to be explained to Donald Trump that the European Union is a customs union, so that it has a joint trade policy, and that Germany and France and Austria and the Netherlands do not have separate policies on their own. Trump is a bilateralist. He would like to divide the Europeans if he could. And so the danger is there as well, I would say.
We seem to be living in an era of ever-growing protectionism. And interestingly, this trend is often connected to the attempt to make industries more climate-friendly. If we look at the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, for example, this is a highly nationalistic strategy aimed at keeping green jobs at home. What is your take on the connection between growing protectionism and attempts to address the climate crisis?
I think there are several links. One link is that greening the economy requires subsidies in one form or the other. The IRA is just a big subsidy program, and Europeans have their own subsidy programs. And once you enter this game, there's always the danger that the subsidies flow abroad, so that the jobs created by the subsidies are then jobs created elsewhere. And this is not what policymakers want. So once you enter a subsidy race, you almost always also enter a more protectionist field. This is almost automatic. The second link is that what we see in many countries is a sort of a coalition between environmentalists or activists fighting climate change, who are very often not enthusiastic about the free markets, or not enthusiastic about globalization. And on the other hand, old-fashioned vested interests in industry. So it's well documented in the academic literature that the steel industry, for example, is regularly asking for protectionism. Now they can ask for protectionism under, let's say, a green in a green context, and that makes it easier, and it provides them with allies from the environmentalist parties or from groups championing this. So that too, I guess, is a connection that's important and that has not been there before.
There are some very valid reasons, though, that people are not enthusiastic about free trade, whether that's to do with the loss of manufacturing jobs or a race to the bottom in terms of wages and working conditions. And that's not even to mention the devastating environmental impact of overconsumption. Do you think we need a new kind of framework for world trade? And if you do, how would it look?
So ideally, what we would need is a greening of the World Trade Organization and the body of law that we have and that is, combined under the umbrella of the World Trade Organization. We probably need rules of how to deal with differences in climate policies. In Europe, we are now phasing in our carbon border adjustment mechanism. Other countries are also using border measures to make sure that their own autonomous climate policies are not diluted or counteracted by international market forces. But that is done in a chaotic fashion. It would be very good if we had a legal framework of how to together decarbonize global trade. What we are seeing now is unfortunately a situation where, because of the increase in protectionism, we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So I think this is a pity, because the forces of global markets would help us decarbonize in a cheaper way. If we are able to exploit the division of labor, specialization, we could pursue the decarbonization path at lower cost. But we are very far from having this international coordination. The World Trade Organization is in very bad health, so at the very minimum, what we should be doing, what the European leaders should be pushing for, is to get the idea of the climate club moving more. You remember Olaf Scholz campaigned on that idea during his election campaign. I think this is, if this is the solution that we have in absence of multilateral organization taking the helm.
Gabriel Felbermayr, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Kate.